I have served as the Whitmore estate manager for 23 years, long enough to know every stone, every shadow, every creak that punctuates the silence of these halls. The mansion was built in 1874 by railroad magnate Edmund Whitmore, and its blueprint has remained unchanged since its completion. I have walked these corridors at every hour, in every season, through renovations and restorations that never dared alter the fundamental architecture. The main staircase rises from the grand foyer in a sweeping curve, its mahogany banister worn smooth by generations of hands. 42 steps lead to the second floor, where the family quarters have housed 4 generations of Whitmores. I have counted those steps countless times during my evening rounds, my footsteps echoing in the measured rhythm of routine. Yesterday afternoon, Mrs. Catherine Whitmore summoned me to discuss arrangements for her granddaughter's upcoming visit. The family has specific requirements when young Miss Eleanor stays at the estate. Certain rooms must remain locked, particular objects covered, and the third-floor archives sealed. These instructions have never varied, passed down through the family like sacred doctrine. As I descended the main staircase after our meeting, muscle memory guided my steps. 42 down to the foyer, as always, but my feet continued moving, finding purchase on stairs that had never existed before. The banister curved beyond its natural end, leading into shadows that the afternoon light from the tall windows could not penetrate. I stopped, gripping the rail, and counted backward. 47 steps stretched above me. I stood frozen on that impossible 47th step, my rational mind rejecting what my senses confirmed. The additional 5 steps appeared seamlessly integrated with the original construction, the wood grain matching perfectly, the wear patterns suggesting decades of use. Yet I would have staked my reputation on the fact that these steps had not existed during my morning inspection of the house. Returning to Mrs. Whitmore's study, I found her arranging photographs in an antique album, her movements deliberate and practiced. She looked up as I entered, her pale blue eyes meeting mine with the sort of measured attention that wealth affords. "Mrs. Whitmore, I must ask about the main staircase," I began, choosing my words carefully. "Have there been any recent modifications to the structure?" Her hands stilled over the photographs. "The staircase, James." "Whatever do you mean? The step count appears different than usual." She set down the photograph she'd been holding, a sepia-toned image of a young girl in Victorian dress. "Different how? There are 47 steps now." "There have always been 42. Is that—" Whitmore's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle tension that I had learned to recognize over the years. The wealthy have particular tells when protecting family secrets. "Perhaps you miscounted," she said, returning her attention to the album. The mind can play curious tricks, especially when one follows the same routine for so many years. But her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the page. That evening, I conducted my routine security check with meticulous attention to detail. The mansion felt different somehow, as though the air itself held a quality of expectation. Each room I entered appeared exactly as it should, yet beneath the familiar surfaces, something had shifted. I saved the main staircase for last approaching it with the careful deliberation of a man who has learned not to trust his own perceptions. The foyer chandelier cast its usual warm light over the mahogany banister, illuminating the familiar curve that had guided my steps for over 2 decades. 47 steps rose before me. I counted them twice, then a third time, my fingertips trailing along the banister as I ascended. Each additional step felt solid beneath my feet, the wood bearing the patina of age and use. At the top, I turned and counted again on my descent. 47 steps, each one undeniably real. In my private quarters that night, I retrieved the original architectural plans from my files. The Whitmore family had entrusted me with these documents years ago, along with various renovation records and historical documentation. I spread the blueprints across my desk, under the harsh light of my reading lamp. The plans clearly showed 42 steps. I measured and remeasured the drawings, cross-referenced them with photographs from my own files, even consulted the original contractor's notes from 1874. Every source confirmed the same number. Yet tomorrow morning, I knew I would count 47 steps once again. Sleep eluded me that night. I found myself listening to the house with heightened awareness, cataloguing each familiar sound and noting subtle variations I had never noticed before. The grandfather clock in the main hallway chimed the hours with its usual precision, but between the strikes I detected something new, a faint echo, as though the sound were traveling through spaces that shouldn't exist. At 3:27 in the morning, I heard footsteps. They moved with measured pace along the corridor above my quarters, pausing at regular intervals. The pattern suggested someone familiar with the layout, someone who knew exactly where to step to minimize the creak of old floorboards. But according to my evening rounds, the family wing was empty. Mrs. Whitmore had retired hours earlier, and no guests were expected until Miss Eleanor's arrival next week. I rose and dressed quietly, taking care not to announce my movements. The mansion's servant corridors would allow me to investigate without being seen, a network of passages that had served the staff for generations. These narrow walkways ran parallel to the main halls, connected by discrete doors that blended seamlessly with the wall paneling. As I navigated the familiar route toward the source of the footsteps, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The servants' staircase, the narrow back stairs I had climbed countless times, now had an additional landing between the first and second floors. The footsteps above continued their measured pace, growing more distant as they moved toward the main staircase. From my position in the servant corridor, I watched through a narrow observation window as a figure descended the main staircase. The architectural feature had been designed to allow staff to monitor the house discreetly, ensuring privacy for the family while maintaining security awareness. The figure moved with familiar grace, her posture unmistakably that of Mrs. Whitmore. But as she descended, I began counting her steps, my breath catching in my throat as the numbers climbed beyond 47. She continued down beyond where the staircase should have ended, her form growing dimmer as she moved into shadows that seemed to deepen with each step. 53, 54, 55. At 62 steps, she disappeared entirely into darkness that appeared solid, impenetrable. The sound of her footsteps continued for several moments longer, fading gradually until only silence remained. I waited for 20 minutes before emerging from the servant corridor. The main foyer appeared exactly as it should, moonlight streaming through the tall windows, the familiar furniture arranged in perfect order. The staircase rose in its sweeping curve, elegant and unchanging. 47 steps. I climbed to where I had last seen Mrs. Whitmore, examining the area with careful attention. The stairs ended at their usual landing, solid mahogany beneath my feet. There was no continuation beyond, no additional structure that could explain what I had witnessed. Yet her footsteps had carried her somewhere, and that somewhere existed beyond the boundaries of any blueprint I had ever seen. Morning brought no relief from the night's impossibilities. I found Mrs. Whitmore in the breakfast room at her usual 8:15 appointment, seated behind fine china and reading correspondence with the composed attention that characterized her daily routine. She appeared exactly as she always did, dressed in her preferred navy blue dee, her silver hair arranged in its customary style. "Good morning, James," she said without looking up from her letters. "I trust you slept well." "Quite well, thank you." The lie came easily, as lies do when the truth would serve no purpose. She folded one letter and set it aside before meeting my gaze. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. About the staircase." My pulse quickened, though I maintained my professional composure. "Yes, Mom. I wonder if you might check the family archives today. 3rd floor, East Wing. There may be documents there that would interest you." She returned her attention to the remaining correspondence. "I'll have the key sent to your office within the hour." The 3rd floor East Wing had been sealed for as long as I had worked at the estate. Family rules explicitly prohibited access to those rooms, and I had never questioned the restriction. The wealthy are entitled to their secrets, and my role was to respect boundaries, not to cross them. But Mrs. Whitmore's suggestion carried the weight of permission, perhaps even expectation. The key arrived at exactly 9:15. The 3rd floor East Wing felt suspended in time, dust motes dancing in shafts of afternoon light that filtered through windows clouded with decades of neglect. My footsteps echoed differently here, the sound carrying further than the dimensions of the corridor should have allowed. The archive room stretched beyond what I remembered of the mansion's proportions, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, filing cabinets, and wooden crates bearing dates that spanned nearly a century. The air carried the weight of preserved secrets, That particular silence that accumulates around things meant to remain hidden. I found what Mrs. Whitmore intended me to find within the first hour of searching. A leather portfolio marked "Staircase Documentation, Private" contained architectural surveys dating back to 1874, but these were not the plans I knew. These blueprints showed variations in the main staircase's configuration, drawn in the same hand, but depicting different step counts across different time periods. 1874, 62 steps. 1889, 55 steps. 1903, 49 steps. 1927, 47 steps. 1956, 42 steps. Accompanying notes, written in various hands across the decades, describe the phenomenon with clinical precision. "The staircase responds to family presence," read one entry from 1912. "Eleanor's arrival coincides with architectural expansion. Departure results in gradual contraction." Below the documentation, I discovered a collection of photographs. Each showed the same staircase at different periods, the step count visibly varying. In the earliest images, the stairs descended far beyond the familiar foyer, disappearing into shadows that camera flash could not penetrate. The final photograph in the collection showed a young girl standing at the base of the extended staircase, her hand resting on the banister. The sepia tones could not disguise the resemblance, the same delicate features, the same intelligent eyes that characterized 3 generations of Whitmore women. A handwritten note on the photograph's reverse read, "Eleanor Whitmore, age 7. Final documented full extension, 62 steps. August 15 is 1889. I cross-referenced this date with family records I had maintained over the years. Eleanor Whitmore had disappeared from the estate at age 7, her vanishing recorded in family documents as a tragic accident during a summer storm. No body had ever been recovered, and the family had sealed the third-floor archives shortly afterward. But according to these photographs, Eleanor had not disappeared. She had descended. Additional documentation revealed a pattern that stretched across generations. The staircase had responded to the presence of Whitmore children, extending deeper into spaces that existed beneath the estate's foundations. With each departure, whether through natural death, departure from the family home, or more mysterious circumstances, the steps gradually retreated. The current Miss Eleanor, Mrs. Whitmore's granddaughter, shared more than a name with her great-great-grandmother. The photographs showed an uncanny resemblance that transcended the normal bounds of family genetics. I found myself wondering what would happen when young Miss Eleanor arrived next week for her scheduled visit. The staircase had already begun responding to her approaching presence, adding 5 steps in anticipation. How many more would appear when she actually entered the house? As afternoon shadows lengthened across the archive room, I discovered the most disturbing document in the collection. A leather-bound journal written in Mrs. Catherine Whitmore's careful script contained entries spanning the past 15 years. Eleanor shows the same inclinations. Read an entry from 3 years prior. She stares at the main staircase during visits, counting steps that the rest of us cannot see. Last night, I found her standing at the 47th step, reaching down towards stairs that weren't there. Another entry, more recent. The family burden passes to each Eleanor, as it has for 4 generations. The house calls to them, shows them pathways that lead beyond our ability to follow. We have learned not to interfere with the process, though it breaks our hearts. A chill settled in my chest as I read the final entries. Mrs. Whitmore had been preparing for her granddaughter's permanent departure, arranging affairs and settling accounts with the resigned determination of someone fulfilling an inevitable obligation. "James has served us faithfully," she had written just 2 weeks ago. "He deserves to understand what he has witnessed, though understanding will likely burden him as it has burdened me. The staircase reveals itself to those who need to know, who can be trusted with the family's deepest truth." I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, measured, familiar, approaching with purpose. Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light. "I wondered how long it would take you to find that journal," she said quietly. "The Whitmore family has carried this secret for 5 generations. Mrs. Whitmore explained, entering the archive room with the weary grace of someone who has borne a terrible knowledge too long. Each Eleanor is born with the ability to see beyond the boundaries of our world. The staircase responds to their presence because it recognizes something in them that the rest of us lack. She approached the photographs I had spread across the reading table, her fingers tracing the image of the 7-year-old Eleanor from 1889. They don't disappear, James. They choose to leave. The house shows them pathways to places where they belong more than they ever belonged here. The staircase extends to accommodate their journey. And you allow this. The question escaped me before I could consider its propriety. Mrs. Whitmore's smile carried a sadness that seemed to encompass decades of loss. Allow. We learned long ago that preventing their departure only postpones the inevitable and prolongs their suffering. The Eleanors are born between worlds, and James, they see things we cannot, feel connections to places that exist beyond our architectural understanding. She moved to the window, gazing down at the estate grounds, where evening mist was beginning to gather. My granddaughter has been preparing for her journey since childhood. The staircase has been calling to her for months, extending little by little as her departure approaches. Next week's visit will not be a vacation. It will be her farewell. How can you speak of this so calmly? I found myself asking, though I knew the question crossed professional boundaries I had respected for over 2 decades. Mrs. Whitmore turned from the window, her expression carrying the weight of accumulated grief and acceptance. Because, James, I have seen what happens when we try to interfere. My great-grandmother attempted to prevent the first Eleanor's departure. She had the staircase boards removed, the space sealed with concrete and steel. She gestured toward another photograph I had not yet examined, the staircase appearing somehow wounded, its lower steps crudely terminated with modern materials that clashed violently with the original architecture. Eleanor remained for 3 more years, but she withered. The light left her eyes, her laughter faded, and she began to move through the world like a ghost of herself. When she finally died at age 10, her last words were about the stairs that led home. Mrs. Whitmore retrieved the photograph, holding it with careful reverence. We learned from that tragedy. When the second Eleanor began showing the signs, we prepared differently. We documented everything, preserved the knowledge, and when her time came, we said goodbye with love instead of resistance. She looked directly at me, her eyes holding a question I wasn't ready to answer. Tomorrow, young Eleanor arrives for her final visit. The staircase will complete its extension, and she will begin her descent to wherever the Eleanors go when they leave our world. I need to know that you understand. The following evening, I stood in the shadows of the servant corridor, watching as 7-year-old Eleanor Whitmore descended the main staircase for the last time. She moved with ethereal purpose, her small hand trailing along the banister, as step after step revealed itself beneath her feet. 62 steps, exactly as the original blueprints had shown. Mrs. Whitmore stood at the top of the staircase, tears streaming silently down her face, as she watched her granddaughter disappear into darkness that seemed to welcome rather than threaten. There was no fear in the child's movements, only recognition and relief, as though she were finally going home after a long and difficult journey. The sound of Eleanor's footsteps continued long after she vanished from sight, fading gradually into a silence that felt somehow complete. By morning, the staircase had returned to its familiar 42 steps. Mrs. Whitmore maintained her usual routines, with the composed dignity that wealth and loss had taught her, though something in her eyes suggested a burden finally lifted. I have served the Whitmore family for 24 years now, keeper of their most profound secret. The third-floor archives remain unsealed, available whenever I need to remember that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only witnessed and honored. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear footsteps on stairs that exist beyond our ability to count them. The house remembers every Eleanor who ever descended into its depths, and perhaps in its own way it misses them too,